There were a few people who watched the first episode, and I'm really happy about that. I already have a comment on that which said that my mic is um, too quiet as compared to the game. So I try to adjust it so you can hear me better this time. Now, yesterday we talked about how a game should start, or at least how this game starts off with the starting areas, and what are some kind of mechanics it uses to lure you into playing the game. Um, Today, what I want to talk about is the different, uh, well, basically the different styles of how you can play a game. So firstly, what I should mention is that every time you play a game, a single player game, let's start with the single player games. The single player games are usually engineered around one or two, but definitely not more than four or three or four play styles. Um, what I mean under play styles is the way you can actually play your game to progress with your character. Um, and of course, I mean what kind of equipment you can acquire and what kind of weapons you can use in order to defeat your obstacles or enemies or whatever that comes in your way. Now, there are, for example, single player games like God of War usually achieves um, mostly one type of play style, which is just actually going and, hitting stuff with one or two of your weapons. Um, Another game would be Doom, which will come out in very soon, actually, just 10 days, I believe. Which is basically about you randomly going and shooting aliens and enemies and everything that literally just comes to your way. But really, that is just one play style, um, which is, of course, it's optimized for that play style. So it would be really silly to incorporate some kind of throwing weapons or swords or wands or whatever in that. Now, so these were the kind of single player games back in the good old days where you had one kind of play style and you were stuck with that. Um, when games like World of Warcraft came out in 2004, there was something new about that game, and what really opened up tons of possibilities and set a milestone in gaming history, basically. Now, what I mean under this is basically that World of Warcraft became a hugely popular game, very well accepted and very well respected game back in the day when it came out, and many people started playing it. And we see World of Warcraft now as a classic of MMORPGs. And one of the biggest changes that this game incorporated is basically the different kind of play styles that you can use to play with your friends online. And this basically set three main, what should I call it, classes. The first one is DPS, which is called damage per second. It's basically a class which deals damage to its surrounding area. So it's a power build. You would just go around and you would have heavy armors and you would have very strong weapons, but at the same time, while you can take and maybe deal a lot more damage, you were not very able to actually heal yourself very efficiently. So you needed a healer, which is the second type of class. And a healer's job would be to heal you as efficiently as possible during your encounters with your enemies. However, a healer doesn't really have much armor or very heavy armor. Mostly light armors are what we are speaking of, and some long-ranged, not even attacks but skills that would actually aid friendly players and team members rather than deal damage to NPCs or enemies or other enemy players. So And the third class is actually a very useful one, which is called a tank. The job of the tank is to take as much damage as possible and lure bigger enemies onto them so that the DPS and the healers can do their job with a minimum amount of what should I call it? With a minimum amount of uh, damage taken, I guess, so no one would die. Now, of course, the healer's job, the tank's job, is to tank someone, to lure the enemies in, and get the attention of those enemies or entities or whatever you want to call them. And while the DPS players damage this entity or enemy, and meanwhile keeping the enemy as far away as possible from the healers, as they are the ones who can heal any team members in case someone would get very low on health. So these are the three basic play styles that World of Warcraft introduced very early in 2004, and it actually works really well because it everyone could kind of get the idea of what their job would be within a team. And you know, if you are not a fighter, you could be a tank or a healer, or if you don't really like healing others, then you could play as a healer. Or sorry, you could play as a DPS character if you like, you know, mashing and bashing stuff. However, this actually turned into a limitation later on, because you know, the more you play with something, the bigger standard it becomes, and when the standard, you know, kind of hits in, then that becomes eventually boring and something that should be improved upon. And this is what I want to talk about today, at how these changes, or how the possibilities of other classes can be played effectively, to basically tackle this idea of grouping yourself too strictly within these three categories of playstyles. So, let's talk about Guild Wars 2 again today. As you can see, I'm playing Guild Wars 2, just walking around. And what Guild Wars 2 did is separated the world, the player versus the world. So separated the game where you would only be able to hit and kill NPCs, so not other players, because all the other players around you are considered to be friendly, and you cannot duel them, you cannot hit them, you cannot basically harm them in any way in the game. Well, not in the game, but in the player versus environment mode, which is basically you playing in this huge map, which is connected to the lore of the game. And of course, this is separated by... Yes, I need to explore this place. Which is separated by player versus player and world versus world game modes. Player versus player is where you have a small group, or just a few, well, a small group of teams fighting against one another, trying to, you know, play some typical capture the flag or deathmatch or something of the sort inside the game, and of course that's being scored. Now, World versus World is very similar to this, except the area you are playing it and the amount of people playing against one another is extremely huge. This is what is called World versus World, which basically means it's actually servers against servers. So if you are on server A, you would be put together with other server A players while trying to capture as many forts, capture as many bastions and trade routes as possible, and trying to overtake these from your enemy, or from your opposing teams, from your opposing world server. And this is, of course, well, what does this have to do with how you play a game? Actually, is well, not really connected still, is it? Because it's just, you can still play uh, against each other in Quake 3 Arena, for example. You just go against one another with guns. That's just one playstyle. Um, and this is why, it's not very satisfactory. You can just kill each other, whatever, in World versus World and PvP. But it didn't really require for you to take on any class or to incorporate or to create groups with different kind of play styles. And this is when Guild Wars 2 introduced raids, back when Heart of Thorns expansion came out. And that was, raids were this kind of really hard challenges for players up to 10 players actually, because it required great coordination, great builds, and basically a full knowledge of what's going on around you. Now, the coordination part can be tackled by understanding the mechanics of the boss that you have to defeat. Is it a boss that eventually takes on every player? Is it a boss that jumps around very quickly? Is it a boss that spawns random ads and then tries to defeat you using that? So do you have to scatter around him, or do you have to group up in one place? Or you can understand what the mechanics of the boss is, then it's simple to understand how the team should be coordinated. However, that wasn't really enough, because coordination is not everything. Even if you have a group of great rangers, for example, or elementalists, you wouldn't be able to defeat it, or not very likely to defeat the boss, because coordination is not everything. The second thing that I mentioned was the build that your characters had to get in order to get the most efficient way of defeating the boss. And this is where kind of I think you understand the intuitive idea of what kind of play styles could be created with this idea of grouping up and creating different parties, different composition of parties to solve a problem together. Now, the second, of course, yeah. So your build is basically the class you want to play as when you consider playing in a raid. And these classes in Guild Wars 2 are quite different from what I mentioned earlier on, from the three categories of DPS and healers and tanks. They are still present in the game, but they have some different roles as well, and there are a few other new ones, which can to a certain extent be subcategorized within these three main categories, because obviously, just like me saying, could you imagine another class? What would it be? If it's not DPS or healer or a tank, then what would the fourth class be? It's just like imagining the fourth dimension. You can't really imagine the fourth dimension as in terms of space. At least not yet. Maybe we'll get there sometime, but I digress. Yes, so what I wanted to talk about is how Guild Wars 2 has implemented these builds into the game, so that it encourages you to play with these different builds and just try with your playstyle. Yes, the playstyle that you like the most, I mean. The reason why I really got into this game was yesterday I actually mentioned this explicitly, is because I didn't feel forced to do anything, and which had its side effects later on when I actually started playing in raids. Now, what this caused, that I was not forced to play as any or creating my own build, is what it actually happened was me using different kinds of equipment, armor, and weapons on my characters that wasn't really effective together. For example, I would wield a weapon which is good um, for maybe critical hits, so it wouldn't damage a lot, but it would deal a lot of bleeding or fire damage or something of the sort. But it wouldn't damage a lot, and then I would have armor equipped which would be good for a healer class. Now, as you can imagine, the boons on these equipment didn't really help each other out, didn't really boost each other's power. So for a long time I played this game without even considering having a build, because what would be the point? I was completely fine without having a build. Um, and I was. PvE in this game is really easy, even without a build. Of course, if you have a build, then it's much easier, but you don't really have to have a build. Unlike in World of Warcraft, if you don't play by your build, then that's basically a suicide mission. So, the game, Guild Wars 2, doesn't force you to have a build. However, later on, when you get to raids, it does require you to actually get some information of what you should play as. And even then, when you decide, you have a lot of options. First of all, you could play my favorite class would be conditional damage ranger, which means that I would have a pet, which also creates some conditions on the enemy. For example, bleeding or some broken ankle effect, which would slow the enemy down, some AoE effect, or some CC or crowd control effect on the enemy. And while I have my pet actively attacking the enemy, I could also attack the enemy from behind, for example, with short-ranged melee weapons, or I could attack him from far away with long-ranged bows uh, or any other weapons such as staffs. Another build would be healer, obviously, which can actually heal not only themselves but the team as a whole as well. And we have other classes as well that could be grouped within DPS, somewhere between DPS and the tank. For example, we would have the class called Engineer, and Engineer is a very interesting, class in Guild Wars 2, in my opinion, because you could take several roles, with the first one being of course the DPS, where you have a lot of damage, but at the same time you can give boons to your party members if they stack up on you. Then you can give them a lot of boons that would help them be protected, or so this kind of plays between a tank and a DPS, and somewhat of a healer as well, because you get effects from this other player person. Now, of course, this is what I mentioned by the original or the classic three classes of DPS, tank, and healers being kind of manipulated or advanced in this game to the further ideas that you could actually play any class that you want, even in a mixture. So you would have a class, for example, as just what I mentioned, the engineer, that would actually be all three together at the same time. Now, of course, not the most effective tank or not the most effective warrior or DPS person, but you would have great advantages of playing as a engineer in this game. Now, currently I am playing as a I have actually no idea what I'm playing as. I think I play as a guardian. Yep, you can see the huge glass mirror thing on my back, which is actually a shield. If I equip my weapons, then you could see I have equipped my shield and a staff. And actually, I have no idea how to play as this character. I use this character to start with a let's play of Guild Wars 2, but due to my university studies and work, I didn't really have time to keep up with myself on that idea, so I kind of halted this idea a few years back. So I haven't really played much as a guardian, but I know that the guardian is supposed to, well, guard people. So that would be a tank, right? Uh, you can see that you have heavy armors, and you have a shield, and you can attract many enemies that if you'd like. To, of course, keep keep the enemy away from your party members, which is very important in a raid or group composition. Now, this game, as I mentioned before, doesn't really force you to create any builds for your character. You can actually create the build based on what kind of appearance you like. If you don't have the capacity to buy, custom outfits from the gem store of the game, for example, the one that I have right now is not part of any armor set. It's an outfit that I am actually wearing. If I were to disable it, outfits disabled, then this is what I would actually look like with my current armor setup. And of course, I could actually equip the helmet as well, because I usually hide the helmet because it kind of hides the amazing, awesome looking characters of mine. Kind of looks, dumb, which was obviously not not something you would consider in the middle of a battle in the medieval times, but this is a game, and since it has great graphics and um, great visuals and visual effects and shaders and all of that, which I might talk about in a later episode. Okay, so this guy's bored, which I might talk about in a later episode. Uh, of course, I wouldn't wear a helmet. As at least I wouldn't want the helmet to appear on my head. Now, I digress. Back to what I wanted to say is that you can actually build your character based on the equipment you like the appearance the most, because you wouldn't really have much drawback later on in the game. Of course, in the raids, yes, you would have drawbacks, but that's not part of the core game. The core game, what I mean under core game, is basically the storyline, and the stories you can actually play. Let's see, what else should I talk about? Right, so as I was saying, there are many builds, and it's actually very interesting of um, how this idea of separating the original three classes or subgroups of playstyles can be tackled, and this is something that Guild Wars 2 is again very conscious and very, well, I guess great about in execution, regarding the execution of this idea. Why am I saying this? Is because every time you think of something, for example, well, of course you want to come up with an original idea. Now, what does an original idea mean? An original idea is something that can, but not necessarily, builds upon some other thing. Now, that's very broad. You wouldn't really, that's not real definition of, or is it? It's really vague, but you don't know how to define originality. So Guild Wars 2, the team, when they were developing Guild Wars 2, they had a great deal of research and development of, okay, we have these three classes that people got used to in other MMOs. Of course, I'm referring to World of Warcraft, but we can mention a few others as well. I can because I don't really know much MMORPGs other than other classic MMORPGs. I know Final Fantasy XIV is one MMORPG, but that's also came out a lot later than World of Warcraft. So I'm trying to think of something that came out in a very similar date than World of Warcraft, but and can be considered as a classic MMORPG. But it really boils down to these three categories, and when you set yourself with the paradigm that we have that you have these three categories, then it's really hard to think about, something new. What would the fourth category be? How can you actually tackle this problem of creating a new class, or actually eliminating the problem of having players to stigmatize themselves, or to mark themselves as either a healer or a tank or a DPS character. Now, why was this important in Guild Wars 2? Why am I talking about this issue of having to create several builds? One of the reasons is, well, I guess it's an RPG, right? As you can see, the game is extremely beautiful. The music is amazing. The characters, the voice lines, the races are very well put together. And what this actually does is that it creates a fantasy game, a role-playing fantasy game. And when you create an RPG, you want people to role-play. You want to give the players the ability to play with one another and to create their own stories. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that when you have a new game, or when you want to create a game where you can roleplay, then you want to eliminate people classifying themselves into something that already exists in another game, right? You're trying to eliminate the freedom of well, you're trying to actually create the freedom of choice for these players. So, for example, I am a guardian, but right now I actually feel like more of a DPS character because I am attacking. I'm not really using my protective skills. I'm just going ahead with this party, and I'm using my attack skills. And I see I'm doing just perfectly fine. And obviously, I could use some of my other techniques to protect these NPCs around me or to heal them, but obviously that would be a chore, and right now I don't really feel like doing it. And I have the option to do that, and it's being executed very, very well in this game. Maybe this series will turn into a Guild Wars 2 appreciation series of some sort. But anyway, I don't know if I wanted to talk about something else. Basically, I just wanted to talk about how you can tackle the problem of... Oh, this dude is exploding. Okay. Didn't quite understand what was going on there, but... but anyway. So again, what I wanted to talk about in this video, to sum up, is the idea of having these classes and how to eliminate this thing of classifying, this mandatory thing of classifying yourself or having to classify yourself into one of these categories, because that would actually create certain problems. And one of these problems, just as a side note here at the end of this video or at the end of this episode, is when I played Guild Wars 2, I did have a lot of problem of people not understanding me, my player, as a unique character with its own little character background that I created for it, and some of its personality traits, but they rather looked at it as a DPS or a healer. It didn't matter what kind of didn't really matter what kind of race I chose. I was either a DPS, a healer, or a tank. And as you can see, this idea or this model of creating a really well established game style, gameplay, is kind of a drawback on your goals. That if you want to create an efficient, if you want to create a game where you give the freedom to players to be whatever they want, then you're kind of have to eliminate these classic ideas, and you have to get back to the planning table and just, you know, come up and just try until you have another working model. So, this video, I don't think it was that very well put together from my side. Again, I have to mention, which I mentioned in the last video, and I will probably mention a lot of times in the future, that I'm not a game developer. I would really love to work in a group of game developers, because it's one of my great passions and, you know, dreams to actually work with a group of computer scientists and artists and modelers and researchers and all that kind of you know, kind of different people, because I think you can well, you know, that's, you know, one of the problem, as, you know, just a subjective opinion about this matter. But I think if you really enclose yourself around with people that you really can familiarize yourself with, then you kind of eliminate the other thrills of the job, that, you know, you may not get some certain ideas that you would definitely, or certain insights or paradigms that, you know, other peoples have in their work. So of course I'm really lucky to be a C++ developer, but again, I'm in close with architects and designers and testers and, you know, people with many field of expertise. So yeah, this is why I really want to to work in a game development company. And don't think it's easy. Building a game or a game engine, building a good game is, I think, one of the hardest things in the entire, well, in the entire computer or computer science industry, if I want to be exact, because it really brings together every single aspect of what can be digitally represented. You know, you would have, you know, not to mention the, well, I'm not only referring to graphics and audio and visuals, but I'm also referring to efficiency, effective programming, and real-time programming, for example. That's not very easy, and I really appreciate games like Guild Wars 2, when it seems that they really put everything together with an extreme expertise and thought. So, thank you so much for watching this episode. I might have been blabbering all this time, but again, sorry for if you don't like it. If you have any recommendations of what I should talk about in the next video, in the next episode, then please leave a comment below. And if you like the video, please leave a like. It really helps me a lot. I'm not making any income of this. It just really feels great to be acknowledged by someone who agrees with my ideas or not. Or if you did not like this video, please mark this video with a dislike, because that would also give me a feedback on what I should improve upon. But if you leave a dislike, then please leave a comment as well on what you disliked in this video, so I can improve. It's really my goal to keep this series up, and I hope you guys will like it in the future as well. And hopefully I will be able to maybe tell you guys a few things once I make it into the gaming industry, or that might never ever happen. it will be the problem of the future, I guess. So, I think I've wrapped things up pretty neatly and very verbosely. I don't think I need to bore you with my blabbering anymore. So, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye. Bye-bye.